Walt Wimmer with Penn State Extension, and want to welcome you to the first in the series from the CRED working group, Indicators Working Group. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that in a second. I want to start quickly this morning or this afternoon to just remind you of the things that are in the pod there on your screen at the moment. If you haven't entered your name and state in the chat box, we'd appreciate it if you'd do that. And after the webinar today, here's the link. We'd appreciate it if you could go to that survey and give us your insights and thoughts and those kind of things. It will help us make sure that others in the series that we have are hit the mark and meet your needs and those kinds of things. And while we're on the topic of the series, our second in this series will be on February 2nd with Charlie French from the University of New Hampshire, and his topic will be Shoestring Evaluation, New Hampshire's Experience Measuring CRED Impacts with Limited Resources and Expertise, a topic I think all of us can relate to because most of us are doing this in many ways on a shoestring and trying to do the best we can with limited time and resources. So save that date as well. But I want to talk with you a little bit briefly just to give you an idea, if you don't already know, about what the CRED Indicators Group is and who we are and that kind of thing. You can see this list. We're been a sort of self-nominated group that came together back in 2012 to sort of put together a national effort to address some of the impact and stories and at the national and local and regional levels of CRED work. And we've been meeting and I'm sure we've talked with many of you, spoken with many of you since then about some of the things that we've been doing and the activities we had and been focusing on in this webinar series is part of sort of the next step in our efforts to sort of ratchet up these opportunities and build the skill sets, build our collective skill sets across the nation to sort of address these kinds of issues. You can see the list there of the things that we've set out to do: gather and assess impacts, develop support, importantly, for CRED programming both politically and internally, and then gather some information to make strategic decisions regarding the importance and value and that kind of stuff. Here's our goals for 2016. I won't spend any time. You can read these. I don't want to take any time from Scott's presentation, but we've been in business now for 2 or 3 years, and it's a great group of folks working across the country, and we've made a lot of progress, but clearly there's a lot of things that we still need to do, and I make now the offer of, if anybody's interested in the work of this group, please contact any of us on the working group, and we'd be happy to have you aboard for sure. So as I said, this is the first of our series, and it's fitting that this one focuses on evaluating public value through impact stories, impact narratives. Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Scott Chazdon, an evaluation and research specialist for the Extension Center for Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota. Scott's had over 25 years of professional experience in evaluating project management, grant writing, research, public policy analysis, adult education, and community development and organizing. And his work with Extension is focused primarily on community social capital assessment, community readiness assessment, and building evaluation and applied research capacity among Extension educators, which is all about what we're about and all about what today is about. The core of Scott's work in recent years has been on impact evaluation, specifically to community development and resource programs. So if you have questions and thoughts for discussion or experiences, please post those also in the chat, and we'll address those after Scott's presentation. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Scott.
Great, thank you, Walt. So I'm glad to be here. Looks like we got a lot of people on board on the call. So as Walt mentioned, as we go through this, I think I have about a half hour of presentation, and then we should have plenty of time for a good discussion. I think that some of this material is very discussion-oriented as you try to engage people in your states in writing up impact stories. I just realized I have to mute my phone. So my overview for today is just to talk a little bit about how we came about doing this evaluation story project in Minnesota. Then a little bit about some of the key influences from the public value literature, key influences for our work. And then I'm going to walk you through what we did a year ago in one region of Minnesota, across extension. So this was not actually just limited to the CRED part of extension. But I will share that, a little background on what we did, and then what lessons we really pulled from it in terms of public value and sort of where we hope to go now. So with that, I'm going to just kind of jump in. There's really two important influences on this project from the evaluation world, and one of them is the most significant change approach, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but that's something that you can Google. It's from the international development world mostly, but it's very much of a narrative approach to telling, as it says, the most significant story occurring as a result of an initiative or program. So that was certainly an important influence on this project. But another one is the work of Robert Brinkerhoff. And we had a graduate student working with us on this project who really brought his work to our attention. And his book is called The Success Case Method. It's very much of a narrative, qualitative approach in which you identify sort of your strongest cases. So it could be from a program, could be a program involving, let's say, leadership development, where you know someone really benefited from the program, and then you go in depth into that case to look at that whole pathway and tell that whole story of how the person was able to really take advantage of the program. And you gain a lot of insight into the ways that the program has been the most successful, so that you can then feed that information back into the future delivery of the program. One thing that Brinkerhoff always says is that this is his narrative approach to evaluation is never intended to be the only way you evaluate a program. So this idea that you always triangulate narrative approaches with other approaches to evaluation that might be more focused on quantification or outcomes, but that the story approach can really help you identify some of those unintended results, but also some of the richness of ways that our participants engage with our work and then go on to use it in ways that we may or may not anticipate. So building on Brinkerhoff's work, and more generally this qualitative narrative approach, was one key influence. And then we had all this great work on public value. And in the case of extension, I'm sure that most of you on the call are familiar with Laura Kolombakidis' work. She's here at the University of Minnesota. She's actually now our state economist in Minnesota. And she has published quite a bit. Kind of this article in the Journal of Extension has been very widely read. And she really highlighted the fact that public value is the value of a public service to individuals who do not use the service, but who benefit indirectly as others use the service. So she really wanted to draw a distinction between private value, which is the value to the direct participants in a program, and public value, which is the value indirectly to others that may come through the direct participants, but is something that we really need to be documenting and capturing. And she had these 4 different pathways that she wrote about for increasing public value by providing information that allows consumers and business owners to make better choices, addressing concerns about fairness, when you create benefits or reduce costs for others, and then when you create public goods. And she is an economist and can much better explain this stuff than I can, but she talks about, in this notion of creating public goods, these ideas of non-rival and non-excludable, and you can read about that in her article, but the idea that a public good is something that additional community members can use that good, but then it doesn't make it cost anymore to actually provide it, just because other people are using it. And this idea of non-excludability is that people who do not pay for the good or for the service can still enjoy the benefits. So that's really the piece that she directs us to think about in our extension work. And as a result of her work, there's been a lot of attention on writing public value statements for extension programs. And that training has gone on pretty much across the country. A lot of it Laura has done herself. Another key influence has been Nancy Franz, who I think is on this call, who has written a lot about public value, building on Laura's work and this idea of public value templates for writing up impact narratives. And she focuses in those templates on these three sort of aspects of the story: the relevance of the issue being addressed, the response by extension to the issue, and the results of the program, including public value. And as you'll see when we start to talk about our stories, it isn't all about results. That when we started to unpack the public value of extension work, we actually learned quite a bit about the issues, what are the issues that really have the most public value, and also the audiences, who are the audiences that we're serving that have the most public value. And then by response, we learned a lot later that you'll see about the way extension responds to its audiences. It can be very much a part of public value. So we'll be talking more about that. Another huge influence on our work is Mark Moore and his strategic triangle. That's his book, 1995, Creating Public Value. And in his book, this is what he calls his strategic triangle. You have your authorizers, which could be legislators. At the state level, they could be legislators, they could be regents, they could be other key players who make decisions around resources at your university. Then on the lower left, you have mobilized operational resources. So basically, your organization has to have the resources to really deliver a program well. And they have to be mobilized in such a way that efficiently deliver those resources to the public. And then in the lower right corner, specify public value outcomes. There has to be some clearly public purpose for the work, whether that's often it's specifically stated in law or statute. Sometimes there's other policy documents that actually tell you what it is you should be doing to serve the public. But sometimes those are less formal, and you have to tease out what is the public value of the work. And so what Mark Moore suggests is managers in the public sector have to manage upward toward the authorizers, the political arena, to gain legitimacy and support for their purpose. And they have to manage downward toward improving the organization's ability to achieve its desired purposes. So we were highly influenced by all this work on public value. And last year, a colleague and I wrote an article in the Journal of Human Sciences and Extension where we laid out this, what we called Evaluating for Public Value Framework. I'm going to put this out there now and not spend a lot of time talking about it because I think you'll see later how we connected this to our story work. But the idea that we had was, if you look at that strategic triangle of Moore's, what we saw at the intersections of these authorizing environment, organizational capacity, and public purpose were really 4 ways that you can really show the public value of your work. And so our article goes into some depth about each of these 4. Organizational credibility, which has a lot to do with the perceptions that people have of the delivery organization. So Extension's ability to engage and develop trust and strong relationships in the communities in which it works, we believe are a huge part of its public value, especially when you compare Extension to other deliverers of programs, both public and private. The publicness of audience, what we mean here is, who are we serving? Are we serving people who might be able to get what we have to offer from other sources? They might be able to afford it from private sources, or there might be other public sources that deliver the service. So finding the right fit with audience ends up being another important piece of public value. And then what's somewhat controversial here is we include program outcomes as part of our model. And as I mentioned earlier, Laura has written extensively that program outcomes are typically considered private value. So we have a bit of an argument for why that they should be incorporated in our overall idea of public value. And we can talk more about that later. But the main idea is that if these are behaviors that the authorizers really want to see, so if people want to see changes in the use of pesticides, and those are clear behaviors that the authorizers want to see, showing those authorizers that we've achieved those behaviors is an important part of public value. And then finally, the broader impacts in the middle, which are all the things that we in CRD think of, like the community capitals, for example, those broader impacts beyond our direct participants. So now to tell you a little bit about our story. About 2 years ago, our Dean and Director of Extension gave a speech at our fall program conference at which all of our educators are gathered, and she called for more impact stories. She called for more narratives of our work that really could tell the public value. She could tell those stories to show the public value of Extension. And that led me and my team, I have a team of evaluators from across Extension. It led us to try out this most significant change process. Initially in one region of the state, the way we're organized is regionally, and we knew that our regional directors, who do a lot of work with county commissioners and having to explain Extension's importance to county commissioners, we knew they really needed these stories. They really needed the information. And so we worked with the regional directors in one part of the state, the central region. I also happen to be on this regional leadership team, so I volunteered to sort of lead the project up. And the dean funded us with some money for a graduate research assistant, someone who was working on her Ph.D. in evaluation studies to help with the project. And we basically, over one semester, collected 29 impact stories from across Extension in this region. And we gave people a fair amount of guidance in terms of how to write those stories, and I'll show you a little more about that in a moment. And we modified the most significant change process a little bit, but we mostly stuck to it. And what that means is that you have people write a narrative about what they see as the most significant change, or a significant change resulting from their work. Then you have the different stories are vetted and reviewed by review teams. It's almost like a review committee for a grant. And so usually there's some sort of rubric for scoring the stories, and we had one of those. And the stories that the reviewers think are the strongest are then selected and sent up to another level of review, in this case a statewide level of review, where we had people from the core administration of Extension reviewing the stories. One of the ways we veered from the process is the most significant change process and protocol really calls for you to engage some external stakeholders in the process. And we had hoped to engage our extension advisors and committee members who are not staff in the process. But, and I'll come back to this later, the administration did not want any outsiders to see any stories that had not been properly vetted by the organization. So we began to see that the process would not be able to work the way we had envisioned it, of engaging some key external stakeholders in the actual review of these stories. And I plan to come back to that issue. We eventually came up with 12 stories that were the strongest among the 29, and those were published as a packet of their own. This was the process. It's kind of hard to see on the screen, but pretty much faithful to the most significant change. If you look at the lower left corner of your screen, the submission was open to anyone in the central region. That included, educators, both state-funded and county-funded, specialists, support staff got involved, and program beneficiaries got involved, and participants. And sometimes there were teams of people that got together to write these up. Then we had our regional review team, and I mentioned they narrowed the list of stories, and a statewide review committee about a month later that chose the top stories, actually chose the top 12. And then we formatted the stories with photographs and turned them into a nice package. We had questions that guided people towards writing their stories, but because this was our first time through, I would not recommend you use these. So I'm going to come back to a rubric at the end of this presentation that I would think is a much stronger tool to use for writing and thinking about the stories. We did have a scoring rubric for this project. Again, this was the one we used for the project, and we have a better one now. But we started with Extension in Minnesota has a strategic plan, and so several of the items in the strategic plan were used for this rubric. One of them was a broad statement about public value. So the story provides evidence of the public value of Extension's impact. There was one about addressing significant issues. There was one item about leveraging resources, one about adapting to meet the needs of diverse audiences, and one really about sort of the quality of the story in terms of its ability to sort of trigger some pride or emotion in Extension's work. So this is, and the committees that reviewed these stories used this rubric to score each story. And then the committees met and identified, they compared their scoring, and then really made decisions about which stories rose to the top. And this is an example of just what the formatting of stories looked like. They were all formatted to be one piece of paper, but double-sided, with photographs. These two were actually written by the graduate assistant, Molly Illis, who we had hired for the program. And she had actually conducted interviews with some of the key extension staff to get the story. So that's one way to do this, is to have someone actually collect the stories, interview people, and write them up. And another way is obviously to have extension staff trained in how to write them themselves. So there's a lot of variation there. And I'm going to talk more about which stories rose to the top a little bit later. But what our graduate student did with my sort of support is after we had all 29 stories, she did a meta-analysis of some of the themes that came through. And some of them weren't surprising because we had this rubric for scoring the stories, and we had told people what's important to write about. But some of them actually were a little surprising. So these were the meta-analysis themes. Extension adapts to meet the changing needs of the community. Story clearly articulates whether or not the program achieved its intended outcomes. So, starting to see that, oh, actually, it was really important in the story that the outcomes of the program were specified. Extension leverages partnerships to expand the delivery of research and information. Extension educators take action beyond their primary purpose. So there were quite a few stories where the educator went above and beyond, largely through their relationships that they had built in serving the public. Extension educators establish trust and respect in the community, and extension programs meet the needs of underrepresented populations in important ways. So it wasn't intentional, but when we did the meta-analysis and we sat down and thought about that evaluating for public value framework that I had written about the previous year, we really thought there was a strong overlap between what came out of the story process and what we kind of already knew about public value from the thinking we had already been doing. And so we kind of overlaid those meta-analysis items onto this evaluating for public value framework. And so what we ended up with are basically, this is a new rubric, a new way of both encouraging people, ways to encourage people to focus their writing in their narratives. So to start on the top, we have two statements about that broader impact sort of center of the Venn diagram. One, that the story demonstrates ways that extension leverages organizations or partnerships. So it's through our partnerships that we really extend the research-based knowledge of the university. And secondly, the story demonstrates ways that extension programming led to these changes in social, economic, environmental, cultural, health, or civic, you could call them capitals or domains of organizational or community life. Then, of course, we can talk about whether you have evaluation data to back it up. That would make your story even stronger. But even having some anecdotal information, if it's placed in this framework, can be helpful. And I'd like to come back to that conversation because ideally you want to have actual evaluation evidence and feed that into the narrative as well. On the right side, you've got these two statements about the audience, the publicness of the audience. So first, it's the same idea of meeting the needs of underrepresented or historically underserved populations in important ways. Quite a few of the stories actually focused on extension work with youth from immigrant communities in the metro area, or working with farmers, immigrant farmers, and some of our stories really were quite powerful, especially the ones in nutrition education and youth development around the progress and inroads extension was making into diverse communities. And then the other piece of the audience is extension adapting to meet changing needs. So those could be traditional audiences, economic development people or farmers, people that extension has traditionally worked with, but really adapting to their changing needs, perhaps changes due to some unforeseen event like floods or drought, stuff having to do with climate change, but it could also be adapting to meet changing needs having to do with economic change or demographic change in communities. On the bottom, the story demonstrates behavior changes that resulted from the programming. As I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of controversy over whether that's really public value or private value, but we felt like having that in the story really strengthened the overall message. And then organizational credibility. Story demonstrates the trust and respect that extension has established with its key audiences. How extension operates, the highly engaged way with which extension educators work, ends up leading to a lot of important things. And another piece of work I do is around this ripple effect mapping. And you often see when we do the ripple effect mapping that the relationships built by extension have all sorts of expected as well as unexpected effects in organizations and communities. So this is really all about that style of engagement that extension has a whole history of doing. So if you apply the rubric to the stories, what we found was that some of the stories, and this is in retrospect now because we didn't use this rubric to actually evaluate the stories during the process, but were we to evaluate them now, what we would see is this story. So this was a story of an extension nutrition educator noticing that people she was teaching were eating unhealthy food, and she took action to create a system-wide change impacting not only Journey Home, which was a facility for recovering addicts, but the person who was in charge of preparing food at Journey Home then took all the information that he was learning and started spreading it through his network of other people who were preparing and purchasing food for similar kinds of institutions. So there was a story of this massive spread of influence of the nutrition education work. And so I took the rubric and put it on here and just highlighted in red the areas of the rubric that were super strong in this story. And if I were scoring the story, I would have scored highly, the story highly in all of these areas. Another story was actually about a flood crisis situation where there was terrible flooding in southeastern Minnesota. And the story focused on how one extension educator had become a critically important resource for the county. Now, this wouldn't be called, it wasn't really a program story, it was more of a personal story. So we can talk more about whether that's a good idea to do. But there was this clear message in the story about organizational credibility, the trust that this educator had built. And it mentioned in the story that this particular educator was on the speed dial of like many, many, many farmers in this region of the state. And the reason they went to him was because they knew that they could get this unbiased, research-based information from Extension. So clearly this hit really well on this publicness of audience, also the changing needs of a key audience, and the broader impact, because people were able to, and this was told in the story, really make change in their community because of the information received from Extension. The third example I'll share was from community resource and economic development. We have a tourism assessment program in Minnesota, and we had stories from two different communities that had been part of our tourism assessment program. And the stories really were successful at showing the broader impacts and the ways that Extension's educational work was being leveraged in the community. And we actually did the ripple effect mapping in these communities, so we were able to document some of these broader impacts. And the story also really highlighted the trust and respect that Extension had built in the two communities. But the story didn't hit on all, on all the burners, on all 6 of these elements of the framework. What I would suggest is that a strong story probably needs to hit on maybe not all 6 of these items in the rubric, but certainly on at least one of the ones concerning publicness of audience. Let me go back to the rubric for a second here. So there's 2 items for publicness of audience. I think a strong story would need to hit at least one of those. And at least one of the statements about impact, and then the organizational credibility and something about outcomes. Okay, so I'm almost done, but here's some lessons learned. So when we went to try to move this process forward, we got quite a bit of resistance, and we as the evaluation team in Extension. We were getting quite a bit of resistance from the upper administration. And it took a while to sort of get to the bottom of it, but it seemed like the resistance was coming from the communications staff in Extension. And so when we did finally learn what this was all about, what we learned was that there was a lot of concern about encouraging people to write stories, and that there had been a history of especially regional directors using testimonials to talk about personal stories to stakeholders like county commissioners. And I think that the dean's office did not want to encourage more of that. So what we are seeing is that we think the focus of these stories has to be at the program level and not at the person level. And we also think we may need to use language calling these narratives, not stories, to avoid confusion with what our communications people do when they write a story for example, we have an Extension magazine. So we want to sort of make sure that this is understood as an evaluative activity and not necessarily a advocacy activity. We also think it's important to start with programs that already have behavior change data. And I'm noticing there's a question in the chat, is behavior change always the desired outcomes? What about programs that target changes in the behavioral context? So I would agree, if behavior change is not an explicit goal of a program, it would be more appropriate to focus on exactly the kind of change that the program is intending to achieve. I think a lot of the programs in my part of Extension here, whether it's leadership and civic engagement, they're definitely focusing on changes in leadership behaviors that they're looking to see, and as well as in community economic development. We have sort of a list of behaviors and competencies as well that we're looking for people to increase. So having some of that evaluation evidence as part of your narrative is worthwhile. Some of our goals moving forward are to avoid any future kind of turf battles or conflicts between evaluators and communication staff. We propose talking more often. We have communication staff in each part of Extension as well as in the sort of central administration. And we're working on a plan to sort of get together on a more regular basis to talk about strategies for writing these impact narratives and hopefully engage the communications people in the process because they're good writers. They know how to write, they know how to effectively communicate, and evaluators, some are better than others at doing that. So the other thing we're looking at is we have an annual, I guess we call it an onboarding cohort program of new educators who go through this. So I'm sure other states have programs for training new educators, new employees. And so the idea is to get them involved in interviewing people and writing these impact narratives. So they may be interviewing more seasoned Extension educators, or they may be interviewing program participants or other stakeholders, but get them engaged with learning about public value by writing these impact narratives. And this other idea that I'm going to keep pushing for is an annual contest. So we have our fall program conference. There is a poster session at that conference, and there's, at least in the past, we've had awards at that poster conference, poster session. Well, how about having a narrative contest where people write these public value narratives and they're evaluated by some team from across Extension. Okay, just a couple more things. And then we'll come to these questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So I just put this out, and I say lots of room to experiment. But Nancy Franz had guided us towards this template. Maybe there could be a template that uses this rubric to get people to really think through the pieces of it. So what was the presenting issue? Who was the target audience and why? And really connect it to the pieces of the rubric, whether that was an underserved group or a changing need. And then why extension? Why was extension a better resource for this information than other public or private sources? What changes in behavior or action occurred? So this is the evaluation evidence about behavior or action changes, mostly by the participants. And then the next piece is the broader impact, the spillover, the leveraging, the ripples, the return on investment. So this is where whatever evaluation evidence you've got could be brought to bear in this piece of the story. Okay, so that's all my pieces. And so I guess people can type in the chat, or you can, I don't know if we have the capacity for people to, connect to the microphone. But I'll take a look at, so George has some comments here. There's seldom any public value impacts in the Kalambakidis model without changes in behavior first. Seems like this means that the broader impacts in your model also depend upon program outcomes. Yeah, I think they do, but the other thing about broader impacts I want to mention, and this is after doing this ripple effect mapping for many years, is that some of the broader impacts may be unintentional or unexpected. And that doesn't mean they're not important. So those might not have been intended to be a result of the program outcomes. And the other thing I've learned is about social capital, that extension programs often build relationships and strengthen relationships. And a lot of programs don't necessarily have that in their logic model. And so if it's not in the logic model, it's not clearly intended as a program outcome, you might not be evaluating it. But there could be other tools like ripple effect mapping or this narrative process to document some of that unintended but very positive impact. Oh, thanks. Nancy made a comment about the rubric. So Mary Simon Lucy had a comment about what an example of behavioral context. So I don't know, Deborah, if you'd be willing to type in a little more about what you meant by behavioral context. And while she's typing, I'll go to Susan's question. What did we do with the stories? So the regional directors in the central region, we have three regional directors. They just love this, and they have used these stories in their testimony or their just meetings with county commissioners. We were very, very purposeful in terms of knowing exactly what county a particular story happened in was very important. At the state level, as I mentioned, the core administration in extension wasn't super thrilled with this work. Now, part of that, I think, was they weren't really seeing this public value rubric until more recently. And now that they understand the public value rubric, there's more interest in these narratives. But we have had some of the program teams using the stories to communicate with some of their stakeholders, so that we have definitely begun to see. And as I mentioned, these weren't just CRED stories, they were from across extension. In fact, some of the strongest ones were in this area of nutrition education. And the program staff in that part of Extension have really enjoyed using some of those impact narratives. Have you ever, I better go back, I think I might have missed some comments here. Oh, okay, so Rebecca said, have you ever collected any narratives from a ripple effect mapping that I completed? Oh, well, the ones as I mentioned for the tourism assessment program in Minnesota, I had been involved in the ripple effect mapping, and then the extension educators really wrote up those stories, but they were also involved in the ripple effect mapping. And yeah, if you do the ripple effect mapping, you have really good material for writing these impact narratives. It's extremely helpful. Okay, so Deborah did get back to us around what she meant by context of behavior, health and place focus that aims at changing the context environment to be more supportive of healthy, safe, and equitable behavioral choices. So outcomes are relative to increased policy supports. So one thing I know just from doing ripple mapping is that you can, when you do the ripple mapping, you can code the information in a variety of ways that can be very useful for this narrative process. One way to code the information is, of course, using the community capitals. But another way is to code the information in, according to this public health model of policy, systems, and environmental changes. So I've been involved in efforts to do that. And then you have all these examples of policy changes that occurred directly or indirectly as a result of the extension program. We talk about the extension program contributed to the changes rather than you're attributing full causal influence. But so you can do the ripple mapping or other evaluation and identify some of the ways the context has changed. Yeah. And Rebecca made a comment about the two methods seem to fit together as a way to triangulate. And they're both very much from the qualitative end of the world. So if your stakeholders, you have to know your stakeholders. If they are likely to be satisfied by qualitative information, then you're great. But some stakeholders are going to really want numbers. And so having some quantitative methods, even if it's more focused on perhaps that piece about the behavior change outcomes, but and then you explain to them that the rest of this stuff about broader impacts is much more difficult to quantify, but here is some qualitative evidence that we systematically collected. That can be a very effective way of getting your point across. So working with Latino audiences, yes, some of our stories in our first round were about working with Latino audiences. I know there were some in the nutrition education, and then there were also stories about working with other immigrant populations in Minnesota. In Minnesota, most of the Latinos are immigrants, so I think I could probably send you some examples of some of the stories we've collected. Have you ever used such stories for grant writing? That would be a question to ask the program staff. I don't know. The nutrition education has a lot of evaluation going on, so they have a lot of evaluation evidence that they can share. So I'm not sure if they've chosen to share the narratives. Oh, the North Central. So the impact indicators. There haven't been. I know that different regions of the country are either have developed or are developing community resource and economic development indicators. We have not, I guess the only connection is the narratives that we collected, as I mentioned, that were for CRD programs. We were able to turn those around and use those directly with our report to the North Central region, because the North Central region wants vignettes. So we were able to take some of those stories and just easily convert them into the format, that a little bit shorter format for the North Central region's impact report. It was super easy because we already had collected them. Are there any other questions? I should mention that if anyone's going to the American Evaluation Association conference, it's the end of this week in Chicago. A colleague of mine from our evaluation team and I will be doing a roundtable about this process on Friday afternoon at the conference, and it's a different format because it's a roundtable discussion. And we'll also be highlighting another project we did, which was a little different, using the most significant change approach. So if you happen to be at that conference, please join us. Oh, good question. I mentioned using graduate students to complete the work. On the whole, how many people were engaged and about how much time was invested? So the graduate student had a half-time appointment, which is a pretty large budget item here in Minnesota because graduate assistants get, some tuition benefits. The dean gave us actually $30,000 for a full year, so it's about $15,000 for a half-time graduate assistant here in Minnesota for one semester. And she was pretty busy. She worked 20 hours a week on the project in the fall semester. It was mostly her time. The regional directors, the three of them that I mentioned, did have to support the project basically by hosting meetings and by sending emails. But really, the graduate assistant did the vast majority of the work in that 20 hours per week. The members of the evaluation team, including me, we read all the stories and we were involved in scoring all the stories, and that was time for us. So there were bits and pieces of time from quite a few extension staff. But finding a student who has those good interview skills, I think, is the most important thing. And then the other thing is training people. I mean, training people to write them themselves is would be a worthwhile investment. And I've thought about perhaps even engaging a graduate student in that training. So yeah, Deborah has some more comments about reporting behavior change when a population approach is the focus. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure. And it could be that if that's the focus of the program, perhaps the outcomes piece of the rubric could be de-emphasized. I throw the rubric out as a guide. It did flow from the work we did, and it flows from the model that we wrote about in that article on evaluating for public value. But this is very flexible, and the key thing is figuring out what works in your state and connecting it somehow to public value, which I think is a helpful term. What is a rubric? So a rubric is basically like a tool for scoring. I mean, sometimes they're used a lot in classroom education when you're grading a student's paper and you have like 8 categories ways that you're grading the paper, and there's sort of the rubric tells you exactly what's an A, or what's a B and what's a C in evaluating that paper. So this is basically the same idea for evaluating a public value narrative. Will my slides be posted so we can access them later? I think that Rachel probably, I'd be happy if Rachel could post them. I think that we do plan to post these webinars throughout our series, probably on the same website of the Southern Rural Development Center. Maybe Rachel could comment.
This is Rachel. So all of the webinars coming up will be on the rrdc.info site. And thank you, Walt. Just put it in there. We'll have both the PowerPoint itself as well as the recordings.
So until February, and Charlie French is doing the next webinar in our series. I certainly would be happy to respond to emails. I think my email address is probably here, and look forward to talking with you more. And please do fill out our evaluation. We worked hard on as a team on coming up with a good evaluation tool for these webinars. So please go and fill that out and give us some feedback.
And I just want to say before we end, thank you, Scott. This has been really helpful and has helped even us on the team who've been working through some of these things, put a lot of these pieces together, and I'm sure it did for lots of others. So thank you very much. This is wonderful. And again, I encourage everyone to go to the link on the website. If there are no other questions, we're just a couple minutes. We may have a minute or two here for a question or two for Scott, but if not, again, the next session, our next in this series will be February 2nd with Charlie French. Any additional thoughts, Scott, or ideas?